Welcome to a new Women's Soccer Weekly here at SDH Networks and OSG Sports. And what we've decided to do this time, John Nelson here, Neil Blackmon there. And what we've decided to do is find out Neil's perspective on the response that was filed by the U.S. Soccer Federation denying the allegations of gender discrimination made by players of the women's national team. Neil, thanks for hanging out with us.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Okay, let's go backwards and kind of work our way forward here to what happened this week. Back in March, so about 2 months ago, as you and I are talking, in District Court in LA, under the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, 28 members of the current women's player pool allege in a filing institutionalized gender discrimination, that's in quotes, that include unequal pay with their counterparts on the men's national team. When that went down 2 months ago, what was your initial thought pattern when that hit the airwaves?
Well, as somebody that, I so my background is as an attorney that's tried wage discrimination cases, gender discrimination cases. So I read a complaint like that and immediately just assess whether or not I think it has some merit. And I thought that they, even more than their original complaint to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that they filed a couple years ago, this was a really well drafted and argued complaint, and it had a couple shocking allegations. I think the largest one, or the most notable one, is the allegation that in some instances members of the world champion women's national team receive 38% of the pay that a man who plays for the U.S. men's national team does. That's a staggering difference, and one that I thought would be difficult for U.S. soccer to explain away.
They file their answer back on Monday, and this is a month ahead of the Women's World Cup when they do this. The Soccer Fed claims that every decision made, quote, with respect to the conduct alleged in the complaint was for legitimate business reasons and not for any discriminatory or other unlawful purpose, end quote.
Yeah, I mean, look, the U.S. soccer response, I think, was fascinating because they essentially concede the argument that women have an unequal playing field. And most of their defense is arguments to the effect of, that there's a market-based reality and that market-based reality dictates, I guess there's two arguments. One, market-based reality dictates that your pay is going to be a little different. And then they say that you bargained for the amount of compensation you get. So they point to the collective bargaining agreement.
Yep.
But the first one is more responsive to sort of your question, at least, that, these are business decisions that are dictated by the market.
But looking at it as we have on Soccer Down Here when this stuff has come out initially, we were looking at the analysis of all of the national team action, whether it's friendly or preparing for competition. And when you have the men's national team seemingly pricing themselves out of a family of four with just astronomical ticket prices and drawing small numbers for attendance, and then when you have the women's national team who aren't pricing themselves out of oblivion and having large crowds, it seems like the economic argument that the Soccer Federation is making, at least from the men's side, has some holes in it, because you would think that margin would be smaller, I would think, financially, if you would actually charge less to get people in the door.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the revenue arguments that U.S. Soccer is making are things that the women had a couple years to prepare for because of the EEOC process, because of that complaint where they just sought, a letter saying, hey, you can sue in federal court because you might have a case, and they end up getting that. And in that time, essentially they're getting to do 2 years of research into what the market-based revenue realities are. So it was really interesting in that sense, is that maybe U.S. Soccer thought that, or their lawyers thought that, because they kind of take a different tact, which I thought was fascinating. I mean, their response says that they essentially say the USMNT is a physically separate organization, and that it competes in separate spaces, it competes in different competitions, and they have separate budgets and separate collective bargaining agreements. Basically, make a separate market realities argument.
Yeah, one of the other quotes that came through, it wasn't based on gender. The alleged differences in pay, not based on gender, but quote, differences in the aggregate revenue generated by the different teams and or any other factor other than sex.
Right. That's pretty standard language in these types of complaints. Is just as a standard affirmative defense that a lawyer would file, is just say um, anything but sex. But their argument, I think, is going to be that either it was bargained for, which would obviously be different than sex, or that that market-based reality argument that I keep coming back to. And I think what's interesting about that is that that concedes these arguments that you know that that the women have an unequal playing ground, and essentially their argument is we can't do anything about what the market dictates. The problem with that is that the U.S. women proposed a market sharing, deal that was based on revenue generation, and they basically made the argument that, hey, if the men make up way more money, we'll accept compensation based on that value, which I think was one of the reasons that the U.S. Men's Players Association was quick to issue a public statement in support of the women's suit.
Yeah.
And U.S. Soccer, their response just basically says that didn't happen at all, which is something that'll get fleshed out in discovery. But I thought that was really, that's a fascinating way to answer an argument that seems to be a repudiation or rejection of the best argument that U.S. Soccer has previously had.
So pay no attention to what's going on over there. That didn't happen, even though other things may dictate that it actually did. It's like pay no attention to the man behind the curtain argument. Is that what we're looking at here?
It really is, because their answer to that was essentially that that's just not what happened. I mean, they didn't explain what happened in the alternative, which they don't have to do in an answer. Right? I think that's important for people to understand. Is that a blanket denial is pretty common at this stage of a lawsuit, but it is kind of fascinating that in their affirmative defenses they didn't explain what then did happen, other than to say, hey, we have a collective bargaining agreement. And I can tell you that just the presence of a collective bargaining agreement doesn't mean that there's not discrimination. I mean, there can be discriminatory conditions that are unenforceable in a collective bargaining agreement. There could be finding that, the the leverage in terms of the bargaining leverage was unequal, and that makes it still violative of the laws that the U.S. Women said. So they have arguments that they can make to the, well, you agreed to this kind of defense.
Neil Blackmon hanging out with us, a dad, lawyer, writer, gator, both of the FOOTBALL variety and the FUTBOL variety. Molly Levinson, the spokeswoman for the national team players who filed the suit, came back to one of the points that you were making earlier, paraphrasing, no legal basis for the Fed's claim that it is anything other than a single employer operating both men's and women's teams who face drastically here. And, where Levinson is saying everything's under one umbrella, the Soccer Federation is saying, well, no, you've got one over here and one over here. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that's most interesting to me is that U.S. Soccer's never advanced that type of argument before, that they're completely different umbrellas. And that also kind of illustrates how far apart U.S. Soccer is from the U.S. Women. And a lot of times when you look at a wage discrimination complaint, or you look at a gender discrimination complaint, what you're really looking for is, where are their primarily issues that they agree on? And then does that get people to the bargaining table? Do you really want to litigate this out? And the way that U.S. Soccer framed their answer, it really seems like they're setting up lengthy litigation, that they just entirely, reject the foundation on which the women's complaint lodges those disparities or says they exist.
The Fed and the women's team agreed back in April of 2017 to a 4-year agreement, which they're right in the middle of. The CBA goes through 2021. and the Fed claims that the allegations don't rise to the level required for punitive damages because there is no evidence of malicious, reckless, or fraudulent intent to deny the players their rights.
Yeah, I think that that's a strong argument that U.S. Soccer makes. I don't think that they're going to win. It'll be harder for the U.S. women to win that this is necessarily malicious, but there's no requirement of that in order to win the underlying claims in the lawsuit. So they can get all the back pay, and they can get the other relief that they're seeking. They just might not get the big punitive damages award.
All right, so you're on the bench for this one. Whenever this gets inside the courtroom, you're on the bench. You're the guy up top with the gavel and the dark robe with the big seal behind you. How, I guess, are you seeing this playing out in front of you? And I guess what would be the wise ways for both sides to sit there and continue to present their arguments?
Well, I think what's going to be really interesting is what lawyers call the discovery process. That the U.S. Soccer is going to be able to maybe depose some of the women and talk to the women under oath, but the real danger in the discovery process comes from U.S. Soccer because they're going to be U.S. Soccer officials that are placed under oath by the U.S. women's attorneys. They're going to have to give sworn statements about how they determine pay. They'll also have to turn over sensitive documents, emails, text messages, you know, internal memorandums that were drafted prior to the lawsuit being filed. Things like that are sometimes things that you don't want leaked to the public, but once they are out in discovery, all it takes is a lawyer sending an email to a journalist for the public to know that. And they're also fighting an uphill public relations battle anytime they go to court with the U.S. women's national team. So I think those are all motivating reasons for U.S. Soccer to get back to the bargaining table maybe before then. But yeah, I mean, I think if you're the judge, or you're a juror in this case, you're just looking for some evidence that U.S. Soccer does treat them differently on the basis of sex. And if it's in any of those documents or sworn statements to that effect, I think that the market arguments already support that.
All right, so put the robe away, put the Jack McCoy suit away for this last question here. As a journalist, since last time I checked, you're heading over to cover the Women's World Cup. When you're seeing all of this happen a month before your players for one of the favorites and one of the top ranked teams in the world is heading over to a tournament, what are you looking at from a journalist sense about how much of a distraction this is? And at the same time, not having it be a distraction, but it needs to be a focus on the larger picture.
I think it's motivating, if anything. I talked to Becky Sauerbrunn, one of the captains of the women's national team in Tampa about a month and a half ago, and she kind of rejected or was a little dismissive of the idea that they're distracted by some of the stuff that's going on. She said, if anything, we're just motivated to win even more, to show that, look at the outrageous discrepancy in merit between the way we perform and the way the men perform. And she doesn't really want to make it about that, but it was an interesting comment because that historically is a team that has played really well when they're disappointed by something, and they were already mad based on how the Olympics worked out in Brazil. So I think they're heading to France, highly motivated for multiple reasons.
All right. So for those that want to continue to keep an eye on Dad, lawyer, coach, Gator, writer of both football and football, how do they do it?
They can find me on Twitter at NWBlackmon, BLACKMON. And you can read me at yanksercoming.com, which is the site I started about 10 years ago, or a bunch of other places that I write. And if you're into college football, you can find me at Saturday Down South.
Well, Neil, once again, thanks for pulling back the curtain from a legal perspective and from a journalistic perspective on all this stuff. I know that a lot of times in a case like that, there's a lot of legal mumbo jumbo, and that's why we figured we would kind of call you to sit there and take the jumbo and put it into a gumbo for us. Thanks for hanging out.
Hey, thank you for having me. I hope I was able to clear some things up.